Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. So today's, thank you again for joining today's MMS information session. The topic for today is artificial intelligence in action, generating claims about measure properties. Just a reminder that at the end of the session, there will be a Q&A, and you can use the Q&A function. You can see that down in the ribbon at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions throughout the presentation, and we'll try to get to as many as we can by the end. So today's presenter is Jeffrey Geppert, and we'll turn it right over to him to get started.
Thank you. Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're grateful for your participation. So today we're going to be discussing the use of artificial intelligence in the development and evaluation of clinical quality measures. And we refer to this work as the AI pilot. So I'm Jeff Geppert. I'm the measurement science team lead for the consensus-based entity at Battelle. Next slide. So our main takeaway for today is that AI is really more than just performing measure development and evaluation tasks in a faster or automated or sort of at scale manner. Rather, AI really does have the potential to transform the nature of those development and evaluation tasks. And it does so sort of in three ways. Sort of used, judiciously, AI has the potential to advance really any scientific domain, but clinical quality measurement specifically, into a more predictable and mechanism-based and evidence-integrated scientific discipline for the purpose of improving quality and safety, reducing burden, and reducing avoidable utilization. So we've scheduled 3 webinars to discuss these 3 topics of predictable, mechanism-based, and evidence-integrated. So today's topic focuses on making measure development and evaluation more mechanism-based, using large language models to generate claims about measure properties. And then a PQM education webinar in a few weeks will focus on making development and evaluation more evidence-integrated. And then we'll follow up with a future webinar that will focus on making measure development and evaluation more predictable. Next slide. So we always start with our vision. We won't talk too much about sort of our vision and strategy. We did have some webinars that we hosted in the fall that are available on the PQM website that talks more about sort of our strategy and approach, and encourage you to look at those. But the 2 things to highlight here is that we're really focused on sort of a transformational change, healthcare system change, and how quality measurement, and more specifically these CB processes, can support that transformational change. And we do so through both using evidence and a meaningful community engagement. And we really feel like those 2 things are mutually supportive. We get more better evidence, better interpretation of evidence, engaging with the community, and then conversely, the community engagement is more grounded in shared experience when it's evidence-based. So those 2 principles kind of simultaneously, and that really sort of guides our thinking about AI as well. Next slide. So the specific problem that we're trying to address is around the perceived burden of quality measurement, and how we can use these CB processes to both reduce the burden and enhance the benefit of quality measurement. And we think about that as in terms of focusing quality measurement resources in this kind of lower right-hand box, where both there's a high impact of quality measurement. So the use of a quality measure will result in a large decrease in adverse events or increase in positive events. We know how to do that, and the effect of that is high. But also that there's a great learning opportunity for quality measurement, sort of a sweet spot of we know in general that how to improve quality, but there's still some uncertainty that we can use quality measurement to learn about. And so we want to do two things. We want to be able to identify what those barriers are that are preventing clinicians and facilities from improving and mitigate those barriers. And then we also want to identify what it is that better performing clinicians and entities are doing, and then try to emulate those, create resources that allow everyone to emulate those. And so that's kind of our strategy, is to try to focus quality measurement kind of in that sweet spot. Next slide. So this is kind of the structure that we use for evaluating quality measurement. Again, we're focused on what the purpose of the measure is, what change or transformation is the measure trying to bring about. And then we use this, what's called a realism sort of framework to really try to dig deeper and to understand exactly how or why does the measure actually work, for whom does it work, and under what circumstances does it work. And so to try to uncover this, we use this ontology, which is called the context mechanism outcome ontology. And so historically, measurement evaluation is focused on really that connection between the measure focus and a material outcome, which we call sort of the importance consideration. Is this measure focus related to something that matters? And the evidence that's been brought forth has largely been in support of that, that sort of relationship. What has been less common in measure evaluations is focus on the mechanisms that are necessary to bring that measure focus about. And we call claims that are associated with, what it is that clinicians and facilities need to do in order to improve performance on the measure. We call that our scientific acceptability focus. And then more broadly, the context in which those mechanisms are used, and what are the barriers, what are the facilitators to using those mechanisms, and we refer to that as sort of our usability evaluation. And then finally, measure evaluations typically focus on sort of the positive outcomes, and they're less specific about the potential harms associated with measure use. And so one of the goals of the AI pilot was to see if we could use large language models, which are very good at sort of being contextually appropriate in their responses, if we could use them to address some of these historically underutilized areas of focus. And we'll see some examples of that as we kind of walk through this today. Next slide. So I want to take a moment just to go a little bit more into what we think of as validity or scientific acceptability of a measure. And we use this definition, which comes from Samuel Messick, and which has been adopted as a standard of validity in the educational and psychological testing area. And so the definition of validity, as you can see it here, is an overall evaluative judgment of the degree to which empirical evidence and theoretical rationales support the adequacy of appropriate interpretations and actions on the basis of the measure. So there's kind of four elements of this that I want to emphasize. One is that validity is a judgment, so it's a decision. And we want to bring as much light as we can to that decision. So we want to be as explicit as we can about what are the claims, what is the evidence in support of those claims, what are the arguments in support of those claims, and we want to be as explicit about those things as we can to inform that decision making. Validity is a matter of degree, so there's always some kind of a residual risk associated with these decisions, And validity demonstrations are largely about sort of ruling out sort of other potential causes of a measure focus other than, the quality of care. But the mechanism sort of focus, sort of changes that a little bit and makes the demonstration of validity sort of a more direct thing. Evidence and theory. So we look at evidence, we look at empirical studies, but we also want a very sound sort of theory about what clinicians and facilities should do to improve performance on a particular measure. And that theory needs to be sort of plausible. It needs to be logical. And we want to make sure that that theory is logical and plausible. And then finally, interpretations and actions. So some people call this sort of a response-based validity and argument-based validity. But again, it's looking at sort of what it is that clinicians and facilities do in response to a measure. What are the choices they make? What are the resources they have available that determines sort of the degree to which the measure is valid? Next slide. So we talk about claims, again, going back to the CMO ontology, we're talking about would, should, and could. A person would make decisions based on the measure because it's associated with the material outcome. Should, there are known and effective ways of selection and choice that the person or entity should use. And then could, any barriers or facilitators to whether the person or entity could use those ways are known and addressed. So those are the claims that we're going to be evaluating and generating using these large language models. Next slide. So our approach to evaluating those claims is to use what's known as an assurance case. An assurance case consists of these three components: claim, argument, and evidence. Now, assurance cases have been around for a while. They're a NIST and ISO standard, common in the systems safety sort of literature. But the benefit of AI is that it makes it much more possible, feasible to actually build these claim, argument, evidence assurance cases and to maintain them over time to sort of, build up an evidence base for the measure over time. And so our goal with these CB processes and with the AI pilot in general is to make sure that the quality measures are trustworthy. And we do that in two ways. One is we want to make all the evidence explicit and explicitly evaluate that evidence. That's about the judgment part. However, identifying, assessing, summarizing literature, very time and resource intensive. AI can potentially help with that. The second is we want to guard against the potential for confirmation bias, which is this tendency to process and interpret information in a manner that's consistent with beliefs. And so this would be like, I believe the measure is valid, and so I'm going to be looking for evidence that supports the validity of the measure. And we want to make sure that we're identifying and evaluating evidence that may be contrary to that claim. So assurance cases have these three components. They have a claim, which is a property of the measure. And we have two sources of claims. We have claims that are provided by the developer, and then we're looking at claims that are generated by AI. Second is we have evidence in support of the claim. And assurance cases take a very broad view of evidence. And so they incorporate both experience and expertise and logic, which tends to kind of be very important in terms of assessing the claims that are generated by AI, in addition to empirical studies, computational approaches, simulation approaches, engineering approaches, all of these things which contribute to the sort of substantiating the truth of a claim. And then the part that is often missing is the argument part, which is why exactly the evidence supports the claim. And these arguments are logical inferences. They're either deductive arguments, inductive arguments, or abduction arguments. And abduction is sometimes referred to as inference best explanation. So that's a type of argument where you observe the effect and then you sort of use logic to infer the cause. And that's the kind of argument that we're typically involved in with quality measures, where we observe the result and we're trying to infer that the result is caused by the quality of the entity and not something else. And so that's the type of explanation that we're typically trying to utilize. And AI can help us sort of formulate those arguments as well as evaluate the evidence. Next slide. So I won't spend too much on this, but this is kind of how the whole system is sort of put together. And the 3 webinars that I mentioned earlier are sort of going to be addressing all 3 components of this graphic. And what we're going to be focused on today is this right-hand side, where we start with a measure submission that has a numerator and denominator. We generate claims from AI about that measure focus and target population. We use our CMO ontology to help structure those claims. And then we conduct a series of analysis. And then the intention is to have a subject matter expert review those claims and then determine whether the claims are arguably true or potentially arguably false or speculative. And if they are speculative or arguably false, then it sort of feeds back into the evidence system where we look for published literature that supports the claim or does not support the claim, and then we evaluate it in the way that we'll be describing more in our webinar in a few weeks. Next slide. So that's sort of the big picture of what we're talking about here. And the point here is just to note that there are really 2 types of validity claims that we're looking at. There's what's called an association claim, which is kind of what we typically think of when we're trying to show a measure is valid. We look at associations between 2 measures, and we sort of make a claim that what's causing that association is quality. But the mechanism claim, we need both an association and a mechanism claim. The mechanism claim is basically we can actually describe what is responsible for that association in terms of these responses and resources. Next slide. And finally, this is kind of the structure of an assurance case. And the point I want to just raise here again is that there's always this kind of residual risk in an insurance case. And the idea is to make a decision with full knowledge of what the residual risks are, and then to be able to mitigate those residual risks, sort of develop a plan sort of going forward. Next slide. Okay, so for the pilot, our goal was really to use a process that was transparent and replicable. And so we didn't want to use any sort of technology or software or analysis that wasn't sort of generally available. And there were 2 reasons for this. One is we wanted you to be able to replicate what we're doing. And so everything that we go through today, you are able to do it yourself if you have access to a sort of a generally trained LLM like ChatGPT or some other model. And so, and we encourage you to do that and to experiment and to follow kind of the process that we're describing here to become familiar with this yourself. The second reason for doing that in terms of the AI pilot was to sort of establish a baseline for the performance of sort of the generally trained models, to understand sort of what the limitations are, what the capabilities are, and then inform in a data-driven way sort of where there might be some benefit to investing in more sophisticated models or methods or different approaches. And so those were sort of the two aims of the AI pilot. Next slide. So I won't go into the details of the AI pilot, but basically what we're talking about is we have a measure submission, we have a measure description, and we use AI to generate claims about that measure using this claim mechanism outcome ontology. Next slide. And what we're really doing is looking at the results that the AI generates and judging them based on sort of their plausibility, their logic, from the perspective of a subject matter expert who knows about the material. And then if there are any claims, that again are potentially speculative or arguably false, then those can be sort of followed up with further evidence generation. Next slide. And this is kind of the structure of what we're looking at: these contact mechanism and material outcome claims, evidence maturity claims, a logic model and a mechanism map, and then finally this realist evaluation. Why does the measure work, for whom, and under what circumstance? So next slide. These are some of the measures we're going to look at. We've looked at several hundred measures as part of this pilot, and we've picked a couple for some sample results. The couple of process measures, an outcome measure, and a cost measure. But we very much encourage you to reach out to us if you'd like to learn more, if you'd like to work with us more on this. We'd be happy to do that, to help try these tools out and see how informative it is to your measure use. So you don't have to be a measure developer in order to use these tools. You could be a measure user, or you could have a measure that's of interest to you. And these tools can help you sort of understand how the measure is intended to work and what some of the challenges might be. Next slide. Okay. Now we're going to get more into some of the specifics. When using a large language model like ChatGPT, there are certain ways that you can structure the questions, the prompts that you're asking ChatGPT in order to improve the responses that you receive. And so some of that is here, sort of defining a persona and a context. Large language models are very context sensitive. And so it's important that you sort of establish the context of your prompts sort of very specifically. And what we have found works well is organizing the prompts sort of along these lines. So one is to establish who you are. You're an evaluator of clinical quality measures. Your role is to understand the context, mechanism, and outcomes that explain how the measure works, for whom and in what circumstances. The context is you have a measure of interest, and then you describe the measure of interest, basically in the descriptions that are typically provided about measures. And then you want to define sort of the measure of focus and the target population. And what we have found sort of works well here is to describe the measure of focus as an event. So something that happens in a particular period of time. So in this case, it's a surgical site infection event that happens in a particular point of time. Sometimes measures are continuous. They might be like an observed to expected ratio or a cost measure. Even then, it's helpful to define it as an event as being where the person experiences, cost that's more than what's expected, or an outcome that's worse than what's expected. But it's describing the measure focus as an event, and then the target population is described as a person who's experiencing that event. So you define the measure focus, define the target population, and then the entity of interest. So in this case, it's a facility, or could be a clinician, could be a health plan. And then we don't really do anything with this person of interest, but it's just helpful to be able to make sure that, because we do refer to person sometimes, make sure that it's understood that the person is in the target population. Next slide. So these are the prompts that we use. So the first part of the CMO ontology is the outcome. And so we have different prompts depending on whether the measure is a structure and process or intermediate outcome, or it's an outcome itself. So if it's a structure, process, or intermediate, we want to know, among the target population, which we previously defined, would you explain the association between the measure focus and a material health outcome? So this is our importance, right? We're looking for that association. If the measure is an outcome, like a readmission or mortality, we just want to ask among this target population, what is the rationale for considering the measure focus on material health outcome? and it provides sort of an explanation for why that is. So that's the outcome part. And then we want to get to the harm part, which is, are there contexts where better performance on, and here we're either increasing the likelihood of the measure focus or we're decreasing, depending on whether it's an adverse event or a positive event, how that might result in harm to persons among the target population. And so we want a description of what are those potential harms that might occur based on better performance. And then this is kind of the summary of it. Would you explain under what conditions the following claim might be true or not true? Better performance on this mechanism complex is causally associated with better performance on increasing or decreasing the likelihood of the measure focus. And this is kind of a good summary of the validity argument that's necessary in order to sort of establish that claim. Next slide. So those are the kind of the outcome oriented. So what is that mechanism complex? Okay. So the first prompt is, would you explain a mechanism complex that's responsible for either increasing or decreasing the likelihood of the measure focus amongst the target population? And that's kind of why we describe the measure focus as an event, because we're interested in the likelihood of that event. Then second, would you explain how other contextual mechanisms may work to either reinforce or counteract this mechanism complex? So this is where we're sort of looking at the context and things that are either supportive or not supportive of better performance on the measure. Then we ask it to build a logic model for either increasing or decreasing the likelihood of measure focus. And we describe what we want that logic model to contain: inputs, activities, outputs, short, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. Then we ask whether there's any broad systemic changes, feedback mechanisms, assumptions, or external factors that should be included in the logic model. And then finally, we want it to describe and draw a mechanism map for the mechanism complex. So mechanism complexes are complicated, but there's, and it's often sort of easier. A logic model is one way of describing it. A mechanism map is another way of potentially describing it. Next slide. Then finally, we want to understand more about sort of the usability of the measure, right? That's sort of what we're getting at with our context. So are there resources to support implementation of the mechanism complex? We want to know about that. Are there barriers or facilitators to implementing these resources? And then here we're asking it to conduct what's known as a realist evaluation. Why the measure works, for whom, and in what circumstances. So there's kind of a specific way we ask about this. So the measure works in basically two different ways. Again, resources and response to those resources. So we're interested in knowing, how does the measure either enable a choice or block a choice you don't want people to make? How does it do that? So we want a description of that. Similarly, it might either enable or block some type of reasoning that the entity might use. We want to know how it does that. Then, and that's sort of the why question. The by whom question is, not every entity has the capacity or the resources to make the choice or conduct that reasoning. For whom might that be a problem? And then finally, what are the circumstances? And there's all sorts of ways of describing context. We talk about cultural or physical or social context. There's different sort of contextual models that one might use. But what we're interested in how that context either activates or does not activate the operation of the choice making. That's sort of the realist thing, is that choice making is sort of triggered by this context. Similarly around the reasoning, in what circumstances. So again, what the goal of this is to say how the measure works, for whom does it work, and circumstances in which it works. Okay, so now we're going to look at some of the results. Next slide. Okay, so this is kind of a summary of a lot of the CMO kind of output put into a table, just to make it a little bit easier to look at. But this is all, the point here is that this is all AI generated, all of this results. So the AI will identify potential mediators that are relevant to this particular measure. It'll describe the mechanism complex, which is kind of the top part. What it is that the clinician or the entity needs to do in order to increase the likelihood of this measure. This particular measure is focused on sort of diagnosis of pneumonia. It'll talk about, potential harms associated with the measure, utilization, benefits and harms, utilization that could potentially be avoided through better performance on the measure. It'll talk about these kind of moderators, which are sort of more of the contextual factors that either make the mechanism complex work better or less better, given the context. And then it talks about these benefits and harms. And so what are the benefits to the patient by better performance on the measure, but also what are potential harms associated with better performance on the measure? And this is probably where our experience has been that the large language models are particularly useful in terms of articulating these harms, which are otherwise sometimes a little bit challenging to identify. The other sort of aspect about a diagnosis measure that is kind of interest is there's benefits and harms, not only for those that are appropriately diagnosed, but also those that are appropriately not diagnosed with pneumonia, but are appropriately diagnosed with something else that looks like. But the big thing to remember here is that these claims that are generated by a large language model, according to that diagram, are what we call unsubstantiated claims. And so these need to be reviewed by an SME for plausibility, and if they're either considered to be speculative or arguably false, then there needs to be sort of evidence generation that follows up with this. That's an important consideration. Next slide. So this is sort of another measure. This one is a process measure related to beta blocker prescriptions after an AMI. So again, it identifies all of the potential mediators, the patient factors that could influence this measure might have to be adjusted for. It identifies what the mechanism complex is, what the avoidable utilization is that would be a benefit of the measure, some of the moderators that might impact the performance of that mechanism complex, and then some of the potential benefits and harms associated with the measure. So this would be sort of a process measure, and it gives a sort of a very interesting sort of identification of harms, psychological harms that it identifies, and things of that nature. Next slide. So this is a cost measure, and so it talks again about sort of the benefits and harms to the patient: decrease in out-of-pocket costs, decrease in complications, decrease in poorly coordinated care, but then potential harms about potential underutilization of needed care, and so it describes all of those things. Next slide. So the purpose of sort of this is not really to go into the results in any kind of specificity. What we're really just trying to demonstrate is what's possible with this AI, that all of these results that the AI is capable of generating, and to give us sort of a flavor or a sense of that. This again is sort of an outcome measure in which it sort of contributes to these different things. Next slide. So that's sort of the outcome part of it, the benefits, the harms, the patient factors that are important. This is the kind of logic model that the AI is able to generate. Again, we've told it what we want in terms of these column headings, but all the content is generated by AI. And one thing I wanted to highlight here is that this particular measure is a process measure, and according to our CMO sort of ontology, the outcome part in a logic model for a process measure is the process measure. So outcome doesn't mean sort of the outcome that the process measure is related to. The outcome for the purposes of the logic model is the process measure focus itself. So in this case, increased adherence to the protocols for diagnosis. And we have I think a link to some of the logic model guidance that PQM has been building to help folks develop and interpret these logic models. Next slide. So then the activities part is more of the mechanism part. So these are the things that an entity needs to do in order to improve the likelihood of the measure of focus. So there's provider-focused activities in the logic model. There's patient-focused activities, system-level activities, all of which are sort of necessary in order to achieve the outcome of interest. Next slide. I wanted to highlight the output column because it's sort of interesting to see. One of the challenges, obviously, is with defining these mechanisms is they can be complex. They can be sort of challenging to measure and to quantify. But the output column gives some sort of quantifiable, empirical things that one should see if the mechanism complex is being adhered to. And so if you think of like a structural measure, this would be sort of a useful column. What should you be able to measure and quantify if in fact the entity is following the mechanism complex as they should, as the theory suggests they should. And so I think this is something that we could be using more in cases where maybe we don't observe the mechanism directly, but we could observe some of the consequences of the mechanism. Next slide. And then finally, sort of really understanding what the resources that are necessary. Again, this really gets to sort of the usability part. So we can define what it is that the entity should do in order to increase the likelihood of measured focus. But are there sort of necessary inputs that are challenging for certain entities? And to define what those are and to identify what the barriers are to those inputs, and to think about how those barriers could be mitigated. Next slide. So this is an example of what a complex mechanism complex map looks like. So again, it consists of choices and resources. And so this is the one for the imaging confirmed diagnosis. Starts with a choice. It generates some resources. Those resources beget other resources, or they leverage other resources. And then the end product of the mechanism complex is the measure focus. Next slide. This is another example, a little more complicated example, a process measure again, where the circle is kind of representing sort of what's within the entity, and then what's outside the entity are some of the contextual factors that make a difference. And then, but again, the end point of the mechanism map is always sort of the measure focus for the measure. Next slide. Here's another one for the cost measure. And the hope or the intention, of sort of making these mechanism maps more explicit is a lot of our discussion when we have, measurement meetings is around this and trying to sort of articulate this. And so we want to be able to make this more explicit in order to sort of inform our conversations around what it is that's really necessary in order to again, achieve the measured focus, which in this case is greater than expected costs. Next slide. So one thing that we're exploring with around these mechanisms is to assess their complexity. And there is a Cochrane tool that has these different dimensions to it that one can use to assess the complexity of a mechanism complex. And the AI is capable of applying this tool to the mechanism complex that it has described and assessing its complexity. And our thought is that trying to do this will be informative. There may be some measures where the mechanism complex is highly complicated, other measures where it's not as complicated. And that should inform our discussion because it really, could inform how likely it is, that the measure will improve or what the burden is associated with that improvement. And so this is the kind of an example of how the AI can help us do things that would be very challenging to do sort of without being able to leverage the AI. Next slide. We won't spend a lot of time on this. These are realist evaluations. Again, we're focused on choices and reasoning. How does the measure work by influencing choices, influencing reasoning? What kind of entities would be, or persons would be challenged with performing those choices or reasoning? What kind of context is either enabling or a barrier? And so this is next slide, just some different examples. But again, the intention here, you can go to the next one, is to inform our discussions around the measures to really understand, how it works and where the environments in which it could be challenged to work, to really inform sort of the measure use. It could be that the measure works great in some situations, not so great in others, and maybe we ought to be focusing, again, going back to focusing our measurement resources where they can be the most impactful, on areas where the measure works the best. Next slide. That kind of focus on some areas. This one focuses on some context. Obviously, if you're in a region that has limited access to community resources, particular measures are going to be much more challenging than other measures. Next slide. You can go on. This is just another kind of what resources are supporting the reasoning or the choice making. Next slide. So I mentioned that, we ask, one of the things we ask the model is, to evaluate the claim that the better performance on the measure is associated with better performance on the measure focus. And so that sort of speaks to validity. And so what we're able to do is take the LLM output and sort of build this kind of a table, which is our evidence maturity table. So we have what's called level 1, level 2, level 3, and level 4 evidence. Basically, the higher the level, the stronger the causality argument. And typically, we're sort of in this level 1 area where we're looking at different associations with different related measures. We sometimes get down into this level 2 area where we're sort of starting to rule out other potential explanations. And then what we're trying to get to is this kind of upper right, this level 3 area where we're starting to consider more of the mechanisms that are responsible for those associations, and then ultimately, into a level 4 type situation where we're actually looking at some experimental or quasi-experimental results. Next slide. Next slide. That's just features of the mechanism. Okay, so I just want to end by talking a little bit about trust. So, we're generating these results. How do we know that we can rely on the results, that they're trustworthy? And so we think of that in different ways. So one is by design. So we use ontologies, we use assurance cases, we use context persona. All of these things work to sort of constrain the input and the output space for the large language model to be contextually appropriate. And our experience has been that largely that has been successful, that the responses are in fact contextually appropriate. Sometimes they might not be as detailed as you might like, and there's ways of going sort of deeper. But by and large, we've seen very few instances of responses that just seem contextually inappropriate. Again, we're using assurance cases, so we're assuming that claims are unsubstantiated, and they're only substantiated if they're tied to a piece of evidence, as we described earlier in the argument. We always engage in expert review. All of these arguments must be considered plausible. We're specifically seeking out harms, and so we're looking at harms to the person, certain contextual in situations that might put people at a disadvantage, and we're intentionally looking for those things. And then again, everything needs to be transparent. The prompts and the responses, all of which are subject to review. And then finally, we want to be able to track performance of this over time, and we'll look at an example of that. But the ultimate, sort of potential benefit is, making measure development more accessible. Measure development can be very time and resource intensive. And so one of the potential advantages of some of these AI tools is it just makes measure development more accessible to a broader, population of folks that are interested in measurement, folks that want to develop measures in the community, but maybe are less experienced. And that's really the hope is to be able to enable that. Next slide. So I just want to give you a flavor for sort of where we're going in some kind of the long term with a lot of this. And so we really view quality measurement as a system, and the use of quality measurement as a systems issue. And so we want to make sure that the system works. And so we want to be able to leverage frameworks that have been developed to ensure that systems are working as you intend them to work. And so one of these methodologies to ensure that the system works as intended is this STPA, System Theoretic Process Analysis. And basically the idea is that, again, we want to understand how it is that the folks that are performing well, how they do that, the folks that are performing less well, how they do that, what exactly needs to happen in order to transform a worse performing entity into a better performing entity. And we have a model to accomplish that, which we call the Quality Improvement Action Model. We want to understand, that's sort of our controller, is that model. We want to understand what kind of actions make that controller unsafe. So what's the context that makes it unsafe? What are the triggers that are necessary in order for that model to work? And then identify the scenarios in which sort of our quality improvement model doesn't work. And so ultimately, kind of the big picture here is that when we have a measure, we want to know very explicitly what it is that folks need to do in order to perform well on that measure, what it is that is preventing them from performing on that measure, well on that measure, what they need to do in order to perform better on the measure, and what are the barriers that are preventing them from doing that. And if we can address all four of those questions, then we feel like our measurement system is operating sort of as intended. So I'll just sort of wrap up there. The next sort of slide, is sort of more description about what the components of the action model are, how it works, what it is that you need to be able to articulate, and AI can help us sort of articulate these different aspects to the model. And then the next slide. And this is a playbook that was developed by the Department of Homeland Security about how one implements these sort of generative AI type solutions. It needs to be sort of mission focused. There needs to be a governance organization. You need to have the tools and infrastructure in place. You need to make sure that you're ensuring trustworthiness. You need to measure and monitor. You need the talent in order to be able to operate it. And then you need to conduct usability testing. So all of these things are sort of informing our thoughts about how to do this going forward. The next slide. And this is sort of how we've thought about developing sort of a set of key performance indicators that we could use to track this over time. So I do want to get to some of the questions that people have put in. So we've looked at a couple of examples. In terms of like informing data abstraction, I think it does, in the sense that, and this actually was a question that came up just a few days ago about being better able to understand what are the steps involved with abstracting data. And there are some sort of modeling approaches that people are starting to use to be more explicit about what are the steps that are needed, what are the resources that are needed, what are the processes that are needed to abstract the data. So that is very much part of our burden assessment and how we think about trying to be more explicit about both burden and benefit. There's a question about whether we've applied the methodology to a patient-reported outcome measure, and we haven't, and we would love to do that. And if that's something of interest to you, please reach out to us. There's a specific sort of request to apply it to a specific measure. We'd love to do that. If you have measures that you're interested in and would like us to take a look at, we'd be more than happy to do that. In terms of the literature review, I would recommend or suggest that you, if you're able to attend the webinar that we're going to do in a couple of weeks, where we're specifically talking about literature review and how we can use these AI tools to perform literature reviews. And so that's what we're going to be focused on at our next at the next webinar. I think it's on the 17th. So then, you know, how this could be used, I think this is really, I think ideally, right, we want to be able to use these kind of tools as early as possible, right? Like as early in the measure development life cycle as we can, to be able to sort of, you know, describe the measure, understand the measure, map out our plan for testing the measure. And I think that's really the intent, is to try to move these tools as early as possible in the measure life cycle, and then hopefully to accelerate that life cycle as much as we can, and to reduce as much burden as we can. That's really sort of the goal, to help sort of guide sort of the measure development. And so by the time it gets to a measure evaluation sort of process, a lot of these things have already been sort of brought forward and discussed and resolved, which kind of speaks to how it might influence the measure development process. We rely, for example, a lot on technical expert panels as part of our measure development process, and I think they could really play a critical role here, right, as the SMEs reviewers of some of this output, and have the TEPs review some of this AI output and evaluate it, identify the claims that are arguably true or speculative. That could be a great role sort of for the TEPs going forward. There's a question about sort of LLMs and clinical data and claims data, and there is sort of a growing literature about that, using LLMs to extract data from unstructured fields, and I think that is certainly happening. It's evolving. I still think, right, the most recent things that I've seen still involve some human review about sort of again, it's sort of a one step higher, where it's not so much replicating what the LLM did, but one of the nice things about LLMs is they provide reasons and rationales, and you can evaluate those reasons and rationales for plausibility. And I still think there's a step of evaluating the reasons and rationales for plausibility. So there's still some sort of human input in terms of the data extraction. So you've asked some great questions. And please, again, I'll stop there, but please reach out to us, and we'd love to talk to you more about this.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you everyone for joining today's information session. The slides will be available on the MMS Hub following the session, and we will have the video and Q's and A's available in the coming weeks. Thank you all so much.